900 Americans are in an isolated village in the middle of nowhere in Guyana in South America. A charismatic man sits on a chair in front of them, watching while they use syringes to squirt poison into the mouths of their own children, right before they're told to do the same to themselves. Fanatical communist disciples with guns march up and down between the faithful, making sure that they carry out this act of revolutionary suicide. Hi guys, I'm Zahir, and this is the story of Jonestown. In 1978, the People's Temple, which was a Marxist communist cult that was set up by Jim Jones in the 1950s, came to an abrupt end when everyone in the cult ended up killing themselves. And this was something that they were told to do by their very own leader, the guy who started the cult in the first place. And what most people might not know about this is that, well, the People's Temple was very well politically connected. The mayor of San Francisco at the time and a number of other connected people were calling him the equivalent of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. This was a movement that was founded on the principles of racial equality and socialism. Like, how did a movement like this, that was based upon those fundamental ideals, end up ending in a massacre? This, by the way, if you don't know, was the single biggest loss of American life, civilian life, that is, before the 9/11 attacks. And the political connections of Jonestown actually go right to the top of the US government, including Jimmy Carter himself, his wife, First Lady Rosalind Carter, and Walter Mondale, who was the vice president at the time. Much of what I'm going to be saying is going to be based on the documentary Jonestown, Terror in the Jungle, which of course tells the entire story of Jonestown and Jim Jones and the People's Temple. The documentary opens with the surviving members of Jonestown, and of course they're mentioning at what kind of stage they are in their lives, and what you really kind of find that quite often these are people who are a little bit on the edges, a little bit marginalized, people who are a little bit lost, and there was one guy who was a Marine in the Vietnam War who said, it messed my head up a little bit. Another person was a woman who had a mother who was kind of at wit's end about what to do about her sister who had a drug habit. And, she was told, well, hey, there's this church and they have a drug program and they might be able to help you out. So what you find is that it's lots of people who, for one reason or another, are just a bit lost and they're needing to find a home. And you find this quite often with cults. If you rewind a certain number of years, had you asked me, cults or catfishing scams or romance scams or those kinds of things, I usually have a kind of a very not very flattering opinion of the kinds of people that get involved in such things. But something that I've read over and over again is that don't think of yourself as beyond that. Don't think of yourself as somebody who couldn't get caught up in that. If what you have is a bunch of people that are lost, a bunch of outsiders, in short, that don't feel like they're a part of society for one reason or another, whatever that is, whether you're somebody who in the 1950s or 60s is in an interracial relationship, or you're somebody who didn't agree with sort of what was going on in mainstream society, then a cult is going to be quite alluring if you have a bunch of people who are all at once are like, hey, come and join us, come and see what we've got to offer you. And what people found when they entered the People's Temple was ideas about racial equalities in the 50s, 60s, when some degree these were controversial ideas, or ideas about equality and egalitarianism and sort of what you might call utopian ideals. And we'll get to this, of course, but we should be careful of utopian ideals. One of the things that becomes apparent about Jim Jones, who founded People's Temple, is that he's a very charismatic man, and he's a great speaker. If you look at speakers throughout the decades, they can move nations. They can garner the support of an entire country and do incredible things. But of course, a great speaker can also do very bad things as well. And at this time, Jim Jones is being compared to people like Martin Luther King, a man who, of course, if you listen to his speeches, they're incredibly moving. They really, they say something to the heart. And one of the things that caught people's attention were the healings. Of course, Jim Jones put himself forward as a supernatural healer. So you'd have people who couldn't walk and all of a sudden were standing up or had cancer, and Jim Jones would remove their cancer. And of course, these things were incredibly powerful. If you're somebody in need of hope, I've thought for a while that the most dangerous person is the kind of person that can sell you hope. Hope is a commodity that's often in very short supply. So if somebody can sell you hope, quite often people give up their entire livelihoods for that. And that's exactly what you find happens with People's Temple. One of the questions about Jim Jones is, what exactly did this guy believe? One of the things that was touched on in the documentary but wasn't talked about too much was the fact that, he was a communist. This was a communist Marxist cult. There really isn't any doubt about that. If you look at a lot of the ideas, he's extolling the virtues of Marxism and communism, and there's a lot of reason to believe that he wasn't really a Christian. He didn't really believe in the Bible, but he was using religion as a vehicle by which he could spread his communist ideals. Though even with that, the communist ideals, is he just using those as a means by which to attain more power? Or was he a true believer? So Jim Jones's own son, who's in the documentary, actually asked the question, well, I don't really know what Dad believed. And I should mention that Jim Jones adopted a lot of children. So one of the things that he did was he encouraged his members, weirdly enough, not to have sex. So they weren't allowed to have sex, but they were encouraged to adopt different children from various different racial backgrounds. So they would have these, what he called these rainbow families. So rainbow families made up of people from different racial backgrounds, blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, whatever it was. And to a certain degree, I can understand why this would appeal to people. The idea is that, well, we're going to break down the racial barriers between people. We're all human after all. So there are a lot of ideas that I can see why they would appeal to people. One of the questions, of course, is, well, who is this guy? Who is this Jim Jones who eventually comes to have thousands of followers, ends up having political connections, ends up creating this village in the middle of Guyana? Who is he? So he was born and raised in Indianapolis. Apparently his dad was destroyed by World War One. His mum wasn't around very much. And he was a bit of a misfit. He was just a kid that didn't quite fit in. He was raised to fit in, but of course he didn't. So he was a bit of an outsider himself. So this is a kid who needs attention, who wants to be seen, for whatever reason is not seen by his own parents or by his own family. And so he sets out to, in a way, find his own kind of flock, his own set of people that will give him the attention and the respect and the status that he wants. He would hold funerals for roadkill. So animals that had just been killed, on the road after being hit by a car, he would get his friends together and then hold a funeral. And he would apparently have a flair for the dramatic. He would like to, get that attention and make a performance out of these funerals for these random animals that he would find. While World War II is going on, of course, every child wants to be like the Allied soldiers. So they're picking up sticks and they're playing with and they're pretending like they're guns, and they're they want to be like the heroes on the other side of the world who are fighting against the Axis powers. Apparently, the Jim Jones himself, as a kid, was much more interested in Hitler and watching his speeches and seeing the way that he had that ability to, as I mentioned earlier, to, with his voice, with his theatricality, with his performance, to garner the support of an entire country, to to move nations. In the 1950s, at the age of 25, Jim Jones ends up beginning his first church in Indianapolis. And he gets a message apparently from his mother about, equality, about helping the downtrodden, those who are lower down the ladder. And so this message, of course, as you might imagine in 1950s America, resonates particularly with Black Americans. And so you find, of course, that they're quite drawn to this message. And so the thing with Jim Jones is, of course, he's not going to be particularly happy with staying in Indianapolis. That's not where all of the kind of the political or the cultural action is going on. But during his time at this church, alongside his wife, they end up doing a whole bunch of public service kind of programs within the church. They're handing out canned goods, they're helping out with food and a whole bunch of different things. They're opening a soup kitchen so that they can help people, of course, who are having trouble with feeding themselves. And when I'm mentioning all of this and a lot of the things that I've mentioned up to this point, like, who would really have a problem with this? Like, most people, that are going to be watching this are going to hear these things and think, well, that's great. Why would that be a problem? And of course, you know where this is going to end up. So it's quite interesting how we ended up at a place of sort of, like, as I said, racial equality and egalitarianism and all these kinds of ideas, and then we end up somewhere very, very different. Pretty obvious when you're reading a little bit more into Jim Jones that really he was a communist. It doesn't really sound like he was much of a believer in Christianity, but of course, when it's like late 1950s, early 1960s America, if you're going to try and preach a particular message, you're probably going to have to do it through Christianity. So it feels like Christianity is kind of the vehicle that he uses to preach his communist Marxist ideals. And so he's saying things like, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which is kind of a basic Marxist idea. But he's kind of couching it in really Christian terms so that he can try and get the message across to Americans, and so that they'll actually listen to what it is that he has to say. And he begins learning from a number of other preachers as well. He starts learning from their style. He starts learning from their rhetorical style, their theatrical style, the means by which they perform and the way they get their flock. Jim Jones at this point is somebody who's getting some followers at this point. But it's, for a guy like him, when you're thinking about the psychology of somebody like him, he doesn't want to be a big fish in a little pond. He wants to be a big fish in a big pond. And so he's getting a little bit too big for, small town Indianapolis. So he needs to find a way to get his flock, his followers, to where the kind of cultural and political action is. So he needs to find a way to get them over to California. And so it is that in 1965, Jim Jones tells his followers that, he's had some visions, or he's had a premonition, and that there's going to be a nuclear war. Now, keeping in mind that, this is in the midst of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, essentially the last iteration of the Russian Empire, and the United States are locked in a Cold War with each other, and they have thousands of nuclear weapons pointing at each other, and there was a real fear that at some point there's gonna, this is gonna go from a Cold War to a hot war. So he's playing on real fears and tells people, well, I've had a vision and there's going to be a nuclear war, and we're not safe here, so what we need to do is we need to move to California, which of course just happens to be the place where Jim Jones can increase his profile and get more followers and get more money and of course get more power. So he moves them to Redwood, California, a place just outside of Ukiah, and he moves, and at this point he's got 140 different members, and one of his followers does warn everyone else. He says, well, listen, he's abandoned the ideas of Christianity, and he's kind of started his own thing now. But those calls are ignored, and enough people join him. 140 is actually a sizable number of people, and this is kind of really the beginning of People's Temple as a political movement, of course, because there's not much going out in the middle of in some town in Indianapolis somewhere. California is, there's a lot going on there in the 1960s. In moving to California, Jim Jones actually ends up getting a job um, teaching at the local university or college, and one of the things that he does there is he starts finding new members. Think about a college audience are going to be very open to ideas about equality and racial equality and all those kinds of things and socialism, which he's preaching. And so he gets, I think, over a couple of years, an extra 125 odd members. By the end of the 1960s, he's been getting these members who are students. He apparently also plants Confederates, kind of his own members within the students as well, so that they can kind of convince other people to join the church as well. Now, there's a little quote in the documentary from Jim Jones's son, and one of the things he says is, regardless of whatever good the People's Temple was doing, my father was building a little kingdom for himself. So you get the sense, of course, that he's trying to build himself up. He's trying to build himself a fortress, a movement, a base from which he can then not just increase the number of members of his church, but of course, increase the number of admirers he has, increase the number of followers he has, increase the number of people that he can command, increase the number of people that he has power over, and which he can then use by which to, start gaining status and respect and power in the broader world outside of his own church. Jim Jones told his followers, that they couldn't have sex with each other, they couldn't get into relationships with each other, they couldn't even get married without his consent, and of course he encouraged people to adopt children from outside of the movement as well. And I have to say that all of this reminds me very much of communist societies. My favorite book is 1984, and I think about 1984, and I think about sort of communist societies under Stalin and Mao and the sorts of things that they were doing, which of course we here in the West, we would think of as just, completely crazy. This is the point at which we see a kind of control over people that extends beyond what you would expect in a regular kind of, whatever small religious community. The point at which he's making decisions about how people manage their relationships, but also how they manage their family, their families as well. So one of the things that you find, for instance, in communist societies is that what they tried to do under, say, Mao, Stalin, and once again in 1984, is that they wanted to break down the bonds between parent and child, because that's, about the strongest kind of bond that you can have among human beings. And what you found among certain communist societies is that they wanted to break down those bonds, that loyalty that you could have between a parent and a child, because what they wanted was for their members to have loyalty to the state. And in the case of People's Temple, Jim Jones was really the state. So of course, if they had loyalty to People's Temple above and beyond their own children even, then they have loyalty to Jim Jones above and beyond their own children. He would advocate for this kind of religious communalism where people would live communally. So, he bought a number of houses in Redwood, and he would stick 12 people in a house for 6, and would essentially say, well, this is the sacrifice that I'm asking you to make in order for a better world. And the kind of world that he's advocating for is, for all intents and purposes, it's one of, of complete equality, and, nobody goes hungry and nobody's poor, and all these great, lovely ideas, these utopian ideas. But of course, if you know anything about utopia, it's a really bad idea, because once you begin advocating for utopia and you say, well, hey, if we do all of these things And at the end of it, what we get is a utopia, is a perfectly equal society where everything's wonderful and everyone's happy. The problem with that is that anything becomes justified. Anything becomes justified. You can say, you can do the worst, most awful, terrible things to justify creating this utopia, which of course is what you found in sort of the Stalinist Maoist experiments, which is where tens of millions of people were the victims of famine. Essentially, tens of millions of people are put through the meat grinder in order to create this perfect, equal society. And it's mentioned in the documentary that Jim Jones is really a kind of an ends justified the means kind of guy. And if that means, well, he has to have control over the relationships between members of the faithful, and he has to break down those bonds between parents and their children, well, you're going to find out how far he's willing to go in order to enforce that kind of control that he has over his own members. If you're liking the video up to this point, guys, please do like, share, subscribe, and do all of those things, because it helps my little channel grow. And I'd like to keep making this kind of stuff. I'd like to continue to make videos and to grow the YouTube channel, so please do those things. It really does help with the algorithm. One of the things that people are encouraged to do is, once they come into the church, is to first off start spending more time with the church. So for Christmas, they're asked, hey, spend time with your church family, with your People's Temple family, rather than with your own blood relatives. And you see this quite often in cults, is that, well, if you find a group and the group encourages you to cut you off from your traditional lines of support, that some alarm bells should be ringing inside your head that this is a cult. And this is, funnily enough, this is something that you also, I think, find with abusive relationships. It's also something that you find interesting enough with certain online scams as well, which is that, of course, if you want to control and manipulate somebody and have power over them and have them do all the things that you want, well, the way that you do that is by making sure that their traditional lines of support, their familial relationship, their friends, their whoever outside of the church, isn't saying to you, well, hang on a minute, wait, what? You can't get married to who you want. You can't get into a relationship with who you want. You have to, give up all of your money and your possessions for this guy. And, interestingly enough, I think Christ in the Bible actually tells people to sell everything they have and then kind of, go and live with him. And Jim Jones kind of does the same thing, but he basically says, give up everything you have for me, because, we're building utopia. And at this point, Jim Jones himself he's putting himself forward as this kind of Christ-like messianic figure, and says essentially, donate most of what you earn if you're working to the church. Give up everything you're doing. In some cases, give up your job so that you work full-time within the church while you're living like a pauper, as I said, like 12 people in a 6-person house. And people they're not living lives with a high quality of living, but people in the church feel like they're doing something worthwhile, that they're working towards a utopia, they're creating a more equal society, and they're being convinced to do this by this very charismatic man that they believe can perform miracles of healing and all the rest of it, and is this messianic figure. So of course they do it. There's actually a quote from Jim Jones where he says, keep them poor, keep them tired, and they'll never leave. And it's a strange thing about human beings in this case. Like, this is almost like a large-scale abusive relationship, right? He's keeping them in poverty, and he's telling them to give everything they have to the church. And of course, the church is doing some good things. They have soup kitchens, and they're giving out canned goods, and they're giving out food. They're helping out the people who are lower down the economic ladder. But at the same time, Jim Jones is managing to increase the hold that he has over the most intimate aspects of their lives. Jim Jones apparently said that family relationships are the sickest of them all, and it really says something that he said that he finds that the sickest relationships are the ones where you tend to, or you're supposed to have at least the strongest bonds. And I can imagine he said something like that, of course, because he wants that control over individual members of the faithful, rather than them having more loyalty, say, to their own children, or children to their own parents. And what this reminded me of while I was watching the documentary was of 1984. In 1984, the children are essentially trained from a very young age to be agents of the state, informers of the state. I think it says explicitly in the book that parents are terrified of their children, because if they're not careful, their children are going to end up informing on them to the state, and then of course they could be dragged off in the middle of the night by, a bunch of jackboot wearing thugs. And so, I can imagine that the same kind of environment is cultivated within the church to try and make sure that from a young age, the children themselves as well have more loyalty to Jim Jones and the church than to their own parents. Like pretty much any cult, of course, Jim Jones end up getting a coterie of women and apparently actually men within the church that he's sleeping with. So he's not faithful to his wife. And at some point, his wife, is talking about divorce, and he tells her, if I can't have them, you can't either, referring to his kids, because of course, if she's going to get divorced, she's going to want the kids, and that's apparently one of the reasons why she ended up sticking around, is because, well, she can't leave with her children. And you'll find this is the norm within the church. Jim Jones really ends up owning the children within the church. It's pretty damn creepy. After they've got a certain amount of money in California, Jim Jones ends up buying a fleet of Greyhound buses, and he uses these buses to send his followers out into the city so that they can preach his gospel, and they can hand out leaflets, and they can get more followers. And they also start finding ways to raise money as well. They're selling pictures of Jim Jones that have been blessed, and they're selling like various different things so that the church can end up raising more money. And so what happens is the church now has more money and it has more followers, and Jim Jones he's really getting what he wants. He's, rather than being that big fish in a little pond in Indianapolis, he's in California now, and he's growing his flock. Jim Jones is doing more of his apparent healings. There's a woman, and she's blind, and Jim Jones stands up on the podium, and of course he's very theatrical, he's very dramatic, he knows how to get people fired up. He's learned from the best, from other church preachers on how he can get his flock interested and excited. And there's a story of a blind woman who can't see. He's standing up on the podium, and he's holding up his fingers, and he's saying, how many fingers do I have up? And she's able to apparently see now, and can see how many fingers he's holding up. I think there's another woman who had been operated on 5 times for cancer, and Jim Jones has healed her of her cancer. Apparently, he would use things like chicken livers and say, oh, hey, here's the, I've got the cancer, I've healed this person of this cancer. There's a particular story of a black woman who, she is taken to the church, and of course she's in front of everyone, and her leg is in a cast, and everyone is told, well, look at this woman, her leg is broken, and now we're going to heal her. And so they cut off the the cast, and not only does she stand up, she starts kind of jumping up and down. She runs down the pews and she runs back and she's dancing and she's jumping, and the crowd's going wild. They're so excited because Jim Jones, of course, has healed this woman, of course, which is evidence of his messianic power and the fact that he's going to lead people to the great utopia of the future. And it turns out that the woman was sedated, so they drugged her. They put a cast on her leg. As she started coming to, they told her, well, you broke your leg, so we put your leg in a cast. But it's fine because Jim Jones is going to heal you. And so they do the thing. They cut off her cast, and she's apparently healed. Of course, she was never healed. Her leg was never broken in the first place. But Jim Jones knows that these healings have power. They have the ability to. It comes back to that thing I said. If you can sell hope, then you can get people on board with anything, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's selling hope to the hopeless, and in doing so, he's raising loads and loads of money, and he's bringing many, many more people into his church. It's around about this time that Jim Jones ends up abusing amphetamines. So he's taking drugs, and I can imagine being at the top of such an organization, with so many members. He's trying to get outreach, he's trying to get more members, he's trying to raise money and all the rest of it. When you kind of think about it, it's almost like he's running a small business is what he's doing, if not a medium-sized business. So you can imagine he's getting quite stressed, but the power is also getting to his head. And so in all of the work that Jim Jones is doing for the church, he's apparently now sleeping like 2 or 3 hours a night. And of course, that's not really sustainable. And this is also the point at which he begins wearing dark glasses. If you see pictures of Jim Jones, he's wearing these kind of dark glasses, almost sunglasses, so that you can't see his eyes. And the reason that he gave to his members was that, the light of the divine light with him was so powerful that if you looked him directly in the eyes, it might burn you up from the inside. And the truth of the matter is that, no, this guy isn't sleeping. He's surrounded by mistresses, and he's taking amphetamines to stay awake and to work. And so his eyes are red and they're swollen, and he's not looking like a healthy man. To all outside appearances, the church is doing very well. They're bringing in money, they're increasing their membership. Everything looks fantastic, except within the church, Jim Jones has begun a decline. He's indulging in drugs, and he, as mentioned, he's surrounded by his mistresses, and I think the stress of running the church is also getting to him. And one of the things that happens is that he begins to become paranoid. Now, if you know your history and what things looked like in the 1960s, there are reasons perhaps to be a little bit afraid. 1960s America was a wild, crazy, chaotic place. People forget that a sitting president was killed. John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Not just that, his brother, who was the Attorney General, was also killed. Robert F. Kennedy was killed by Sirhan Sirhan in a hotel while he's campaigning to be president, to be the next president after JFK. Elected president, that is. And then, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is killed. Malcolm X is killed. Fred Hampton is killed. And so you have a lot of public figures, particularly those, of course, on the left, who are being shot and murdered. And so Jim Jones becomes very paranoid about this. And using the church organ, the People's Temple propaganda paper, he ends up sending out the message to his people that, well, the FBI or whoever is going to be coming after us. my life's going to be in danger. The church is going to be in danger because look at all of these people that are being killed. There are, and there were real reasons to be a little bit afraid. I can imagine living in 1960s at that point and being like, as I said, sitting presidents and top level politicians and movement leaders are being killed. Of course, it's a scary time to be alive. And Jim Jones starts saying things. Well, look at World War II and the Japanese camps where the Japanese were interned during World War II. And he says, well, that's going to happen again. That's going to happen to us. They're going to start doing that to black people. They're going to start doing this. And you should be afraid. He starts cultivating this paranoia, cultivating this fear in a climate of fear and paranoia that already exists within America. So it is in May 1972 on a Sunday that people are out. People's temple members are out and they're having food, and there are tables out and everyone's kind of enjoying themselves, and people start hearing these pops, and then somebody screams and says, "Father's been shot," because Jim Jones is, he's their father. He wanted his flock to see him as their father. And so he's shot, and apparently he's carried away, and people are hysterical. They're hysterical. Of course they're going to be. Their leader has just been shot, and everyone is absolutely terrified. And so he's carried away, and people are crying, and they're traumatized by this entire thing, and they're all called back into the church building. So everyone gathers in the church building, and they're despondent. They're in a very unhappy mood, as you might imagine. Everyone is in the church, and Jim's security have the shirt that apparently has 2 holes in it from the bullets, and of course Jim Jones is stood there and he doesn't have a mark on him. And of course people start crying, and people are so happy and they're overjoyed and they're ecstatic over the fact that their father, the leader of the church, is okay. You can't kill Jim Jones. He's basically a god. He's the Messiah, right? The powers that be apparently tried to kill him and couldn't, because he's just such a divine being. Except, of course, as you may have figured out, the entire thing was staged. The bullets were blanks, and the entire thing was staged so that Jim Jones could look like the divine messianic godlike figure that people wanted him to be, and of course, which was the way that he wanted to be seen as well. And so the assassination attempt achieves a couple of different things. One is it binds the church together. It creates a kind of a common enemy, of course, like the FBI, the government, what have you, and blames them. It creates this us and them mentality, and once again, it reminds me of 1984, which is that what you want to do is you want to create an external enemy that binds people together so that they work together to work against this common enemy, and it also kind of shows who's willing to stay as well, because if you're willing to believe that he's this messianic figure that can survive an assassination attempt after being shot twice, then you'll kind of believe anything, right? And you'll follow this guy all the way to hell, which is, in a way, is kind of what ends up happening in Guyana, because the society that he creates in Guyana really is it's hell on earth, as a mirror image of the kind of the societies that he's emulating under sort of under Mao or Stalin or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or Laos. By 1972, the People's Temple has a San Francisco branch, and I think that's their headquarters. And of course, San Francisco is where a lot of things are happening. As I said, it's kind of culturally and politically significant. And the thing with Jim Jones was, as I mentioned, he's not content with just having power over his own church members. He wants power himself. He wants to be a power broker himself. And so it's here that he begins using his church to start making those kind of political plays and building those political movements. Of course, at this point, he's kind of already known as a guy who's started all of these social programs and is giving out food and is helping the poor and holds these kind of these ideas, which of course are very much in line with the civil rights movement. At a time when people are, very, very unhappy in the early 1970s, he begins inculcating himself into the local politics. He starts donating money. He starts endorsing and campaigning on behalf of particular candidates. He starts making his moves to become a power broker in local politics. Jim Jones is loving the attention that he's getting. He's not only getting the attention, of course, he's hanging around with the right people. He's making friends with the right people. He's making friends with powerful people, people with real political power themselves. And just as an example of this, Rosalind Carter, who is Jimmy Carter's wife, Jimmy Carter being the president, she was campaigning for her husband and was going around making speeches. And apparently, they couldn't get enough people to show up for her speech. So somebody got on a phone to Jim Jones and said, "Hey, can you bring some people over to this speech?" And of course, they have the buses, and so he buses in a bunch of his members. And so when Rosalind Carter shows up and makes this speech, there are hundreds of people, and they're cheering and they're very happy. And in doing so, the speech doesn't look like a damp squib. It looks like it's a successful speech that fires up a lot of people. And also in doing so, Jim Jones has shown what it is that he's capable of doing. He's capable of marshalling people. He's capable of doing exactly what he wanted to do when he was a kid, which is to get lots of people and to have them do his bidding. And that additionally, of course, creates those political connections and puts him in the right books in the case of the Democratic Party, in the case of Jimmy Carter and his wife, because he's able to get those people when they're needed to do what needs to be done during a political campaign. It's at this point that Jim Jones sets up the Planning Commission. Now, if I say the word Planning Commission, that sounds like a kind of like very boring, grey, bureaucratic sort of department or something of, I don't know, like a bank or whatever. But the Planning Commission in the People's Temple were really the equivalent kind of the Sea Org that you find in Scientology. When you look at what they really are, they're a domestic intelligence agency, or in the case of the People's Temple, they're an internal intelligence agency. This is Jim Jones's personal checker, his KGB, his kind of secret police. The Planning Commission end up sitting in on meetings and end up taking notes on meetings and taking notes and building profiles on individual members of the People's Temple. Find out what they like, what they don't like, who they're close to, who they're not close to, really what their kind of personal opinions are about the church and Jim Jones. And this is how we start getting to a point where Jim Jones wants power over individual members of his church, and so he can't do that, of course, by himself now. He's now built himself this, as I said, it's essentially a domestic intelligence agency. He's building a apparatus within the church to allow him to do that, and things get pretty dark at this point. One of the surviving members that's interviewed in the documentary, Vernon Gosney, he had his ears pierced and he was wearing earrings, and for whatever reason Jim Jones took issue with this. He was told it was bourgeois, and of course that's another sort of sign that, of course, Jim Jones is a communist. He does not like things which are bourgeois. And Jim Jones also takes issue with the fact that Vernon Gosney talks back, "These are my earrings," and what kind of thing. And what happens to Vernon Gosney? Well, he catches a beating. As I said, this kind of like very boringly named planning commission, if you are found guilty of infractions, if you're falling asleep during meetings, if you're having an affair, if you talk back, if you're told to do something and they don't like what it is that you're doing, a bunch of the planning commission members are going to get together and they're going to beat the hell out of you to make sure that you understand that they're the ones who decide what you do. They're the ones that decide what is appropriate conduct within the church. They are the church's enforcement mechanism. There's another instance of Willie Malone, who's 15 years old. He's a kid. And he's being told off for talking back. He's being told off for having a mouth on him. And of course, what happens? Same thing. Well, Willie Malone catches a beating. They beat the hell out of him because what you're supposed to do if the planning commission tell you something is yes, sir. No, sir. 3 bags full, sir. Otherwise, they're gonna beat the hell out of you, and that's what happened. Some of the audio in the documentary is absolutely chilling. Hearing Jim Jones as he's taking pleasure in this. He's taking pleasure in this. You can really hear the sadism while he's giggling, he's cackling like some sort of villain, while church members are getting beaten up by others for things like talking back or having earrings. It's really, really awful. There's a point where Jim Jones says, you fucking bitch, don't mess with me, I'll kill you. And he's laughing, he's giggling, he's enjoying getting that revenge for those slights and those disrespects that he feels that he's enduring. Very clear signs of sadism, of somebody who's enjoying watching other people that are punished physically for having the temerity to talk back to him or for doing things that he disapproves of. Grace Stone is one of the members of the church who ended up surviving, and she recalls another member in the church that took a beating, that was beaten bloody and bruised, and then the next day was praising Jim Jones and talking about how much he loved him and how much he loved the church. And she said that she saw this and said, I'm never going to allow that to happen to me. And once again, this reminds me very much of 1984, and of course, sort of Stalinistic, Maoist, communist societies, where what ends up happening is they'll beat the hell out of you, and you'll still have to praise the dear leader at the end of it, either because your brain learns to do what is good for you so that you can survive, or because, what else are you going to do? You're going to have to lie about it. It's a reminder that, in 1984, Winston says, I love Big Brother. I love Big Brother, who is kind of the dear leader in 1984. And Jim Jones took leaving the church personally. Once you entered the church, you couldn't just up and leave. And once again, it's like it looks very much like an abusive relationship. I mean, it's a cult. This is what happens in cults. You can't leave. And one of the reasons why they don't want you to leave is not only because it might show other people that they could leave, but also because if you start running your big mouth and start talking about all of the nasty, awful things that are going on, not just within the church, but which are being carried out and being ordered by the dear leader himself, then his great, perfect image that he has cultivated, in the political world, well, that's going to take a number of hits. Church members are made to start signing confessions, ridiculous confessions for things, of course, which they never did. That they were planning to kill the president, that they had abused their own children, and that they had lied about a number of different things. And there are points as well that church members are made to sign blank pieces of paper. And you might have 50 people in front of you. And Greystone says, in the documentary that, if you refused to sign, people might come up to you and say, oh, is there a reason you're refusing to sign? Do we need to be worried about you? Are you thinking about leaving? And keeping in mind, what's happened up to this point about, if you do something that the planning commission don't like, you're going to literally be beaten into submission because that's the way things work within the church. So Greystone makes a decision to leave the church. Now, the problem is that Greystone has a son, and Jim Jones claims that he's the father of this son. His name is John Victor Stone. And so she decides to try and get out. But of course, as I've mentioned, Jim Jones wants control of, not just the church members, but he wants the children in the church. As far as he's concerned, he owns them. Greystone can't leave without leaving her son behind. Now, you think about that for a minute. There's a cult and there's no way you can get out without leaving your son behind. Keeping in mind that Jim Jones had said to his own wife, you'll die before you take my kids. And so Greystone ends up leaving with one of the bus drivers. She packs a small suitcase and manages to escape. And up to this point, by the way, she's already been threatened. Her life has already been threatened by Jim Jones. She had whatever complaints she had within the church or against Jim, and he essentially says, if you don't stop acting out, I'm going to kill you. And keeping in mind what he's capable up to this point, it's reasonable to believe that this is a real threat. This is a sadistic man who will not be crossed. And so Greystone ends up getting out. And so she ends up, escaping to a different state. She's asleep and she starts hearing these popping sounds outside. And she's filled with terror and she's like, oh God, oh no, they found me. They found us already. And it turns out, it was just fireworks. It was the 4th of July. But she was so full of fear and so full of paranoia about what the church were able to do that, it's coloring everything that's going on within her life. In the context of a number of People's Temple members leaving, including Greystone, as I mentioned, so a number of people have left, and of course they're ostracized, and in some cases their children and their other family members are left within the church. They can't leave. And as I said, if you try to leave, once you're outside of the church, you're on a hit list to be hunted down and killed by whoever has been ordered to do so by Jim Jones. When Jim Jones had first moved his flock to California, there was a vineyard. There was a place where they're growing grapes, and he ordered the People's Temple's faithful into the church. And what he does is he has these styrofoam cups with wine that's made apparently from the grapes grown in the church's vineyard. He hands out these styrofoam cups and says, try this wine which we've made. And this was one of the ways that the church was making money, by the way, wine. And after everyone drinks the wine, he tells them that they've been poisoned and that within an hour they're all going to die. And people start becoming hysterical. Some people are crying, some people saying, I can feel myself dying, and people are kind of losing it, as you would if you've just consumed something. You've just been told all of a sudden that you've got an hour to live. And something like 45 minutes goes past, and Jim Jones then says, this was a test. There's no poison in the wine. And you can see the obvious parallels with where this is going. There are different points throughout where what Jim Jones is doing is he's testing his faithful. Just how far are they willing to follow him? You've got all of the healings, because if people saw the original healings back in the day and they're like, well, I don't really believe this, then they're going to get out. In the case where there was the apparent attempted assassination of Jim Jones, and of course he survived being shot twice. Well, people, whoever sticks around is going to be the most hardcore of most hardcore. And although the People's Temple has grown to a few thousand members by this point, in sort of the mid 70s, and it's kind of limiting the number of people that can join. Those that do join are much more willing to serve Jim Jones and to see him as this messianic figure. And so Vernon Gosney in the documentary says, at this point, when I'd been told it was poison and then it wasn't poison anymore, I should have gotten out. But he didn't. A lot of people within the church, the reason they stuck around, even if they didn't believe the healings, they found out that the healings were faked. The reason they stuck around is because they thought that they were doing something good. They were building something better. They were building a utopia. By the time it gets to 1973, Jim Jones he may be a sadist and a psychopath and a narcissist and all those things, but he's not an idiot. You don't create an organization like this by being an idiot. He knows that if enough People's Temple members leave, given all of the beatings and all of the illegal stuff that's going on within the church by the planning commission, eventually law enforcement is going to come for him. Authorities are going to come for him. And if enough people are prepared to testify against him in a court of law, he's in big trouble. The church is in big trouble. And so he starts thinking about what he's going to do. What if the FBI begin investigating? What if the authorities begin closing in? So he makes a trip to Guyana, which is a South American country. It's next to kind of to Venezuela. And he's scoping places out to, once again, move his flock the same way that he moved them from Indianapolis to California. He's going to see if he can move them now outside of the United States. Because, of course, he doesn't want to be caught by the FBI. Because there's now some negative publicity, and we'll get to that. But he chooses Guyana for a number of different reasons. He chooses it, of course, so they're a socialist country. Doesn't sound like they have good relations with the United States. I'm guessing they probably didn't have an extradition treaty with the US as well. They're non-white and they're English speaking, and this is the place where he's going to build his great utopia. So he says to people, like, this is where we're going to do it. This is where we're going to create the promised land, our great socialist utopia, where everyone's free and everyone's equal, and we don't have to worry about the government trying to kill us or being investigated or trying to shut us down or whatever it is. And so he starts scoping the place out in 1973, and he starts making propaganda for his own followers, because he now needs to, he's not just moving people from one state to another, in this case in the US, he's now moving them from the United States all the way to a completely different country, where he's going to try and create a society from scratch. So it reminds me actually a little bit like of the Rajneeshis, if you've ever seen Wild Wild Country on Netflix. And by the way, if you'd like for me to make a video on that, I'd be more than happy. It was a really great documentary. I'd like to talk about the Rajneeshis, but it's honestly kind of impressive the way these kind of new religious groups, these cults, end up creating these new villages, new towns, just from scratch, just from people who are kind of lost in their lives, and end up building entire communities, literally building like houses and living facilities. It's quite an amazing thing that they're able to do. It actually shows what human beings are capable of, even if it is, in this case, in the service of a crazed cult leader. People's Temple members, some end up moving to Guyana and start building this settlement. And as I said, it's quite amazing what they managed to do. They clear away a whole bunch of like jungle forests, and they build this settlement in the middle of nowhere. They build it in the middle of nowhere, and so they clear away this forest and they start building these living facilities. And there are videos of church members who are being interviewed for propaganda purposes, ostensibly enough, and talking about how much they love it and how much they love the work and how they're building the great promised land. They're building this kind of new Eden, this new utopia, and how great and wonderful it's going to be and how equal everyone's going to be, and just of course because Jim Jones is getting ready to be able to convince the rest of his flock, all of them, to move over at some point. This is the point where the heat is being turned up on Jim Jones and the People's Temple, because what's going to happen next is that a reporter is going to start reporting on Jim Jones. He's going to speak to former People's Temple members, including Grace Stone, who are going to say to him, let me tell you what you don't know about Jim Jones. And they're going to spill the beans. They're going to tell them everything about the beatings and the Internal Intelligence Service, the spying, the death threats, the cult of personality, the fake healings, everything. And once the story gets out, the heat's really going to start getting turned up on Jim Jones to try and get the hell out of Dodge, to get out of the US and to make his move and to move all of his flock over to Guyana. But that's going to be for part 2 of this video, where we're going to find out about what actually happened in Jonestown. If you like this video, guys, thanks so much for reaching the end. Please do like, share, subscribe, of course. It helps my little channel grow, and I'd really like to make more of this kind of content, and of course other kinds of content as well. And it helps with the algorithm, so please do all of those things. Thanks very much again, and please do take care of yourselves. Goodbye.